Everybody, just review from yesterday. What was it called where British citizens demanded universal suffrage, no pay for parliamentary members? It didn't pass, but it showed that there was a real big desire to reform. What was that movement called? Yeah, the charters, or the charter, or the Chartist movement. And what other things we go over? Oh, what do you call it when the workers realize that alone they have no power? They unify with the idea of getting better wages, conditions, and more control. That's unions. And what was in socialism or communism? Who control, or what was their ultimate goal? What kind of society did they want? Somebody said a classless society. Not everyone equal, classless. All right, no conversation to have. Who would they would control what? The workers would control what? And whatever that meant, the capital. Now there's gonna be big disagreements. I gave you one of the people who wrote the Communist Manifesto. Who was that? Karl Marx. Yes, Karl Marx, a German journalist. During the Civil War, he actually was in the United States for a couple of years reporting on the war. Did we get to the concert of, is that where we could Congress of Vienna, concert of Europe? Is that where we went? Yeah. Let's do it. Give me a second. Wait. Sorry, I'm hitting 50 buttons, they're not working. All right, we got right to here. Does it look right? Does it look right to everybody? So after Napoleon, and this was to keep the status quo, the essence of conservative, I got to get the conservative a little bit down the road, but a few things about it. Do we have occupation in France? So they want to go back to the old borders before the French Revolution. Now, of course, they can't go all the way back. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire is gone. The French Revolution came, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. But the big thing they wanted was to reestablish that Bourbon king, the Bourbon or Old French monarchy, King Louis XVIII. And so they brought him back after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo for one more time to reestablish the old order. So we got to get to three philosophies then because of this. I love how they're keeping Louis XVIII under the table here. Oh, before we get to that, a couple changes. No, you do not need to know every one. I'll tell you which ones you need to know. So after this, the big changes at Vienna because of the Congress and the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. Why they all came in, I don't know. The ones that are underlined, you need to know. Let's go over those really quickly. A German confederation. So the Holy Roman Empire is gone. Napoleon did the Confederation of the Rhine. They turned that into a massive confederation of Germany of over 30 countries, 30 states. Yes, stop. Ones that are underlined. And then I'll come back and I'll just kind of briefly explain a couple other ones. And the leading states would be Prussia and Austria. But you'll notice some of Austria and some of Prussia is outside the German Confederation. Yes, I know, it's kind of weird. Also, Britain. Britain got total control of Cape Colony. Cape Colony was a big one. That was a Dutch colony they got. Cape Colony would become South Africa. Tip of Africa. And Sardinia. The Kingdom of Sardinia. For a number of reasons, they're going to get, this is called the Piedmont area and Genoa. Very important. But this will become very important in the movement to eventually make an Italy. They would call reunification of Italy, but there never really has been an Italy. You know, the Roman Empire is not the same as what Italy is now. And so they're going to basically the beginnings of the creation of an Italy and the beginnings of a creation of Germany. It all starts right here. Now, a couple other things. Russia got Poland, so you don't need to write this down. Let's go here. Austria got big hunks of land, including this, and this will become a big deal because it's part of Italy. Switzerland was neutral. Norway and Sweden would be unified for the rest of the century. And so, even though they claimed going back to the way it was, It's a whole new world. And the three of the leading powers and Britain would come together and form what's called the Quadruple Alliance. And their idea was to maintain the monarchy, no more revolution. They don't want any more kings on a pike, king's heads on a pike. And these were supposed to be the four main powers: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And these three would call themselves the Holy Alliance. Britain was very reluctant to join this. Britain wanted to maintain the peace, but Britain didn't want to be tied into an alliance. And they would eventually pull out of the Quadruple Alliance, and that's why they call this the Holy Alliance. Britain wanted to be unaligned. And they didn't want to be tied to anybody, so they could pick in any conflicts, which is what they did in the 18th century. So through the rest of the century, as Britain had the Industrial Revolution and became the most powerful country, at least economically, in the world, they never had a real ally or real alliance. They would not have an alliance with another country until, does anyone know who? They almost allied themselves with Germany. That fell through. They hated it. Never guess. Wyoming. They allied themselves with Wyoming, of all places. You're not getting this down. Because I made that up. Japan. Why Japan? They didn't like Russia. You're a Russian. So we've got to get to these new ideas that came out of this French Revolution. Here was the problem. They could try to say, we're going back to the way it was. It will never happen again. The kings will be on top and everybody will know their place. Never again. Now, the American Revolution will be part of this. But the French Revolution had even greater change. And this is worldwide. So let's get to these. The first one is this concept of liberalism. Liberalism. And liberalism, all kinds of people say liberal today, and we'll get to conservatism in a second. People constantly misuse those terms today to the point where they're almost meaningless. But let's get to what the definition of was, at least in the 18th and 19th century. So liberalism literally comes from the term liberty. And what it meant is that the individual alone will be self-sufficient, decide their own fate. That is liberty. They will be able to decide their own fate without interference of others. Sink or swim on their own. And that means to a true liberal for everybody. And therefore, everybody must have natural rights. And so this idea is we could reform this. We don't need a revolution to give rights like the French Revolution. And you remember John Locke? This comes a lot from John Locke, these natural rights. Now, do you remember what John Locke's natural rights were? Everybody has certain rights, which are, do you remember? Yes. That's one. You know the other one. Life, liberty, and property. That will go, now, there'll be a couple different philosophers who will eventually get to the American, that Jefferson will copy for the American Declaration of Independence. That would be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is another way of property. And the French would say liberty, fraternity, and equality. But we all have these rights with the idea of being. Now, when I meant we, it was variable. We until I got them, and then I don't care about anybody else. And the only way to establish that everybody has rights is they want a constitution. Laws written down. There's never really been a constitution. Britain had like the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta, but it was never one document. To this day, Britain doesn't have one. The United States would be one of the first to write a true constitution in 1787. And it was this kind of hodgepodge of compromises and all kinds of stuff, and there's issues with it. It's called the Constitution. But it created a republic. And that was the best way. Now, many of these liberals did not believe in democracy. They were not Democrats. They didn't necessarily want people to have too much of a voice, for that matter, let alone it wouldn't be voting on laws and deciding their own fate. or for that matter, picking their leaders. They're like, this is the best system to guarantee everyone rights, but only certain people can vote for their leaders, certain people in charge. And they believed in a market economy. Adam Smith. That's when they talked about that invisible hand. Remember, talked about the invisible hand, because what sets prices and wages and costs? The interaction of what in a perfect free market? The interaction of supply and demand. And so, no government interference, like monopolies setting up friends to get good business or plush contracts. Let the invisible hand decide it. And therefore, if everyone has rights, we have a constitution guaranteeing rights, and the market economy based upon no government interference, separate, no government interference, therefore will lead to the most prosperous society. And that was liberalism. So they are most certainly not socialists. And jumping on. All right, so that is the invisible hand. We're going to come back to utilitarianism. And let's get to conservatism. So conservatism was the reaction to this. Oh, wait a minute. Everyone looks back at liberalism. Did I say the Enlightenment? Yeah, the liberalism was directly connected to the Enlightenment. They directly connected to this Enlightenment idea. We all have rights. The United States would create a liberal republic. The Declaration of Independence is a very liberal document. The Constitution, not as liberal. It's a little more conservative, but still more liberal than, let's say, a dictatorship. So the United States, its roots is very much liberalism. Conservatism does not like that. But there'll be elements of this where people who might be liberals for a while till they get their rights and then become conservative. So this is a reaction to the French Revolution, to liberalism, to the Enlightenment. And that's probably the most famous one, Edmund Burke. Where we at? And their idea, restore the old hierarchies, especially monarchies, where you have king and nobility on top, clergy, free people, serfs, slaves. And everybody knew their place on top. And why are they on top? They are superior. They're better. Or they could say they're ordained by what? What is the term for God ordaining them? Close, divine right. Now, I've mentioned divine right before in this class. That term actually didn't come about until here. Get their power from God. And so everybody has a place, and they're supposed to be on top, and you are supposed to obey. But don't worry. There's always somebody underneath you that you can. In fact, the story was there's somebody you can put your foot on their foot. So even if someone's doing it to you, you can do it to them. And that's how they keep it in order. This is very much authoritarian. The more authoritarian you are, probably the more conservative you are. The less authoritarian, the more liberal you are. To this day, my guess is we probably all have elements of both. Sometimes I will, I'm in charge, yeah. So those who support this is the ruling class. They like this. Obey because you're supposed to. My authority is legit. And so this whole idea about you having rights, you can have all the rights you want. You're still going to do what I tell you to do. Also, a lot of peasants adopted this. And not for the, they had nothing. But they feared urban. They feared the urban cities. They feared the radicalism in the cities. Like in France, they feared the cities because that's where the revolution started. They also feared the fact that they knew so many other peasants who lost their land, and they went to Gin Alley in the big city and were impoverished and living in tenements, and they didn't want that. And I should add, that's the way it is now. More rural people fear urban, and they're generally more conservative in the United States now. More urban, more liberal. Partially because you're living with next to each other, you have to kind of adapt to it, but there's a real fear. And the peasants thought that the urban people looked down on them. And yes, people do that today. So Edmund Burke is probably the most famous example of this. He wrote a series of pamphlets that would eventually come out into a book called Reflection on the French Revolution. And he laid this out, that hierarchies are natural. Hierarchies are natural. It is natural for one person to be on top, and it is natural for you to obey those above you. I put that down. So it is natural. And I can't emphasize that enough. He said it's natural, so they're going against nature. So what would conservatives feel about slavery? Why would somebody working for somebody else? Maybe it's wrong to actually have a slave, but you know, a serf, it's okay. So a few things about it. They said inherited I meant to say provinces. So they defended inherited provinces, or they defended inherited privileges. If you inherited wealth or position, that should be perfectly fine. That is normal. You should inherit it. If you inherit wealth from somebody, that means because you must be better or superior than those who don't inherit wealth. And this would be precursor to a philosophy called social Darwinism by the end of the century. And we are going to learn about social Darwinism tomorrow. Social Darwinism would become the most dominant philosophy in the world to this day. No one likes to say social Darwinism because it's going to have bad connotations. That whole fascism thing was all about social Darwinism. But most people are the most dominant philosophy, if you really got down to the roots, social Darwinism. So they inherited, defended inherited privileges. Also, they said it provided stability. And this is a big one you have to get. If everybody has individual rights, it counts. If everybody's out there demanding the right to vote or civil liberties or freedom or the idea to say no to somebody or decide where they live or when they go to the bathroom or when they eat, chaos. The lesser people have got to know their place. If they don't, it blows up. How do we know that? That's when they're executing people with the guillotine. That's what they said. So they're very much opposed to this. And so you're going to see a lot of movements from the 20th century saying that democracy leads to chaos. If you demand rights, it's chaos. Yeah. No. No. No, conservatives are generally more believe in hierarchies. Yeah, now there might be some people who call themselves that say that they're a liberal, but actually follow these concepts. Because that's something that's happened about liberals and conservatives. Those words have been so misused so much now that they're almost meaningless. I mean, I've heard people being called, you know, that they'll say someone is a liberal, and then they'll call them this, and then someone else will call them a conservative because they just don't even know what the terms even mean. So we're talking about the classical meaning of it. And so you get people who call themselves a liberal naturally be quite conservative, and people who call themselves conservative naturally be quite liberal. They just don't know it. And so we're talking about the classical definition. But individual rights are chaos. But generally, I mean, you're going to look at the most conservative elements in the world today, like let's say in Hungary, and they're fascists. They don't like individual rights or freedoms. They don't want any immigration, nobody that looks differently than them. Yeah. So at that, also, the state is supreme. The state is empowered. You must obey the state. And that is where you get the elements of something called nationalism, which we'll get in just a second. And one other important element to them, democracy is either weak, you're a weak, ineffectual country, or it's a dictatorship. And you might say, well, how is democracy a dictatorship if the people are voting for their leaders? What they said was, the people are so, if you let average people, AKA you people, vote, you will be easily swayed by somebody who will make promises or act like the big leader, act like they know more than you, will hold a big rally, get you all to think together and vote. And therefore, it's not really democracy. It's because you are sheep and you'll follow whoever will lead. And that's why they said that democracy was actually dictatorship. We see it in the United States when we start becoming a democracy called Jacksonian democracy. And the opponents of Andrew Jackson would say that the people who voted for him, they're actually voting for a dictator because he's the general and has his reputation, and they're not voting for what Jackson believed in. Jackson's quite the complex character in American history. And so let's get to the other element. And this crosses both liberalism and conservatism. And it's called nationalism. And this is the idea that some kind of cultural group should have self-government. The people of, let's look at the Austrian Empire. There are so many different groups here. We have Germans, German-speaking people, culturally German, called Austrians. But we also have culturally Germans who live in this area here that aren't Austrians. Then we have Czechs, we have Moravians, we have Ukrainians, Galicians, we have Hungarians, we have a bunch of different groups of Italy. We have most of them are Slavs, but Hungarians and Austrians are not Slav. We have Croats, we have Slovenians, we have Passives, we have all of them. And also, what about the Poles? Here are Poland, they're part of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and they want their own country. So some kind of cultural unity. Usually what it is a people of this cultural unity. Were you in the? Oh, okay. It's usually language or a common history, some kind of tradition, something that binds people together. Now, this is actually kind of complex because this nationalism will begin on the French Revolution. It will begin in the United States. The United States doesn't have that common binding of things together. So it's going to kind of make up one. Italy will do it relatively unsuccessfully in the end of the 19th century. France had it because we're the French, even though they're still divided. Britain, we're the British. Germany would literally make a tradition up to try to unify all these different Germanic-speaking peoples together. This will have bad consequences down the road, but it's also, once you are a country, intense pride in your country. You know, intense pride in your country. Intense. So it's either I want a country and self-government, or once I have it. And it's intense love of your country. Why? Because it's my country and they're like me. It's not for what the country stands for. It's almost blind love of the country. It's nationalism. It's not the same as patriotism. Patriotism is love of the country for what it stands for. Nationalism is love of your country because it's your country. This is pretty dangerous. The apocalypse will happen because of nationalism. We'll get to it in 2 weeks. World War I. Nationalism. And so you're starting to get all of these revolutionary movements for independence. And it's no coincidence this happened after the French Revolution and when the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Oh, sure, there are people who wanted more rights and freedoms, but it never really happened that way. Or it might be a king who was like, I'm going to break away and then form another monarchy. No, these are people saying, I'm going to create a country for the Greeks. I'm going to create a country that serves for the Albanians. I'll make a country out of that. This is really, really new. And it's going to start spreading across Europe. And so where you're going to see it, like by the end of the 19th century, you'll see it here in Ukraine. You're kind of making now the full circle what's happening right now. When all of a sudden, wait a minute, we're not the Russians and they treat us like garbage. We're going to be our own country. And that starts then. And so this was kind of liberal at first. This had really a lot of liberal ideas about self-rule. But in the 20th century, nationalism became more and more conservative, especially when the far right wing, a movement of the 20th century that would start in Italy called the fascists, and they would adopt this. And now we have neo-fascism on the rise in the world today. Really push this idea of our country alone is better. And you're either with our country or you're the enemy. So let's get to one revolution. Oh, almost forgot one more movement. God, there's so many good movements. The Romantic movement. No, this is not romantic love. The Romantic was this idea of pining for a better era. And I always think of this idealized time as the good old days. And so this idea that there was a generation before that things were just better. And let's go back to that better time. And this is really going to hit at the same time. So you have all these changes of liberalism, nationalism, revolution, Napoleon, industrial revolution, and this Romantic era would begin. And this idea of going back. So I can vividly remember in the 1970s, during the pretty weird economic time all around the world, high inflation, much higher than today. Inflation is actually dropping. But a lot of people are looking back to the 1950s and ignoring the bad things about it, but going back. In fact, the most popular television show of the 1970s was a show called Happy Days in the United States. In fact, it's worldwide is the most popular show. I was talking to my brother's ex-wife, who's Italian, and she remembers watching Happy Days with been dubbed in Italian. I have to remind that must have been just hilarious because the show was had so many American references, and then sent it to Italian. It must have made no sense at all, but they loved it. But they forgot the good parts. And this is pretty conservative idea. Go back to the way, not the way it was, but the way it should. Everyone got that? They don't want to go back exactly to that time. They want to go back to this time before, but we can also we'll improve those parts or just conveniently forget the bad parts and go back to the way it should have been. In the 1920s, in the United States, they went back to the 1890s. Through the Great Depression, they went back to the 1920s. Conveniently forgot the bad parts. I can remember in the early 2000s, they went back to the 1980s, which conveniently forgot the 1980s. In fact, the 1990s went back to the 1970s. And I just read an article today about, now I don't know, we live in Helena, so you might not be a full representation of young people, but the article was in Slate magazine and it said that young people are looking back to the early 2000s. Are you looking back to the early 2000s in here? I don't know if that's true or not. I'm sure it was somebody who was much older than the people they're talking about, but I just thought that was fascinating. But it was a lot about this individual and a lot about medieval. And my guess from some of your faces, no, I don't remember bits and pieces. I remember a lot about the 80s. I remember a lot about the 70s. I remember about the 60s. 50s, I remember. 40s, 1940s, a little bit. I was pretty young. I was pretty young in the 40s. So, revolutionary movements. We're going to jump right to here. Last two things you have to write down. Balkans. This is a nationalist independence movement that began in the Balkan Peninsula. To the Balkans. The Balkan Peninsula have an area that have been fought over back and forth. There would be horrible struggles. And if you look at the map, so it's north of Greece. The Ottoman Empire controlled much of that area. And so there were Catholics, some Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Muslims living there. This was a real hodgepodge of different groups in here. And the Serbs, this would eventually become Romania, and Greece would fight independence movements there. And I should add that all these groups lived on top of each other, also with huge populations of German immigrants, Albanians, Kosovos, Jewish population. This will be the powder keg right here that will lead to World War I and Armageddon. to be in the Balkans. But write down last thing then, the Greek Revolution, 1821. The Greeks. So, the Greeks were part of the Ottoman Empire, and they would revolt. Okay, so we are going to start the data universe change because I always stop and add stuff. Talk about 10 minutes and then we'll finish it up tomorrow. And what is due on Monday? I changed it. What is it? I want 19.4 first. Remember I said we're going to 19.4 first. Everyone got that? So let's put everything away. 19.4. Here is now I know I'm handing out worksheets, but I don't want to see any photos out. Let's put that away. The day the universe changed, and I like this because it talks about other scientific changes that are going on in this era that all relate to the Industrial Revolution, and it's a good place to put it right in here in this era. Yeah. Josh, can you get the lines? Matt, did you get that line back? Here we go. Maybe. The next one? I'll take care of it.